Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today, we continue our look at Weimar cinema, the creative outburst of movie making in Germany in the 1920s. Today's subject, the godfather of all vampire movies, Nosferatu, from 1922. This is a film that has a huge stamp on film history, but is itself still a miracle to watch. We'll be talking about that and much more after today's screening. Joining us will be Professor David Logowski, who is a noted expert on the international tradition of horror cinema. Now, take this journey to Transylvania in Nosferatu. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. Quite a film, Nosferatu. How can you dislike a film that has a line like, "Your wife has a lovely neck"? There's a lot to talk about this film. It's an extraordinarily powerful film 100 years later. Great filmmaking by every standard, and also an enormously influential film. Happily, we have somebody with us today, returning to City Cinematheque, I'm happy to say, Professor David Logowski from Montclair State University, who has spent years thinking about these things and teaching several generations of students the history of horror cinema. He's also an expert in queer theory and its relationship to cinema, and is working on a book about James Whale, known in many ways as the director of some of the great horror films, but a man whose talent reached far beyond that. Let's get back, however, to this particular film. Just situate the film for us in its time. It's 1922, it's Weimar, Germany. What are some of the first things you would say just about the film itself in its historical context?
Well, first of all, it's great to be back, Jerry.
Always a pleasure.
Yes, thank you. I mean, you know, Weimar cinema needs to be seen, and this in particular, in relation to the aftermath of World War I.
Okay.
I mean, you know, Germany, I mean, you know, all of Europe was just decimated. And so a film that deals with this kind of chaos, upheaval, you know, there are crumbling buildings, you know, unstable relationships. And you know, in the aftermath of World War I, something that often happens are periods of illness. Right. You know, equally important was the international flu pandemic that is believed to have killed more people than World War I did. And if you think of Nosferatu, with the infestation of rats and the plague, people dying of the plague, you know, I mean, people thinking, you know, oh, it's just, you know, a harmless mosquito bite, but then, you know, I mean, you know, the proliferation of coffin imagery, you know, not only, you know, Count Orlok bringing his coffins to town, but, you know, the parade of coffins in the street. So, you know, the flu pandemic. I mean, it's a time of great upheaval, demographic shifts. One point worth mentioning is the debate about the film in terms of Jewish representation. Okay. And the influx of Jews into cities and such. You know, some people have criticized the film as, you know, Count Orlok is another one of those predatory characters. You know, he's poring over the contract and so concerned about, you know, owning property in the city. Right. He's got, you know, the sharp features and the large, right, elongated, you know, sort of hooked nose. And unfortunately, in the history of anti-Semitism, you know, Jews have often been, you know, linked with, you know, invasion and plague. Right. And a pestilence. I mean, Jews, you know, in Europe and elsewhere were put between a rock and a hard place. I mean, if anti-Semitism kept them from achieving something, you know, they were hated as being a drag on society. If they were successful, there was this fear of their success. So, I mean, it participates in, you know, wartime discourses, you know, the flu epidemic, the Jewish question. In terms of intentions of the filmmaker, you know, there were Jewish members of the cast and crew. Murnau was very protective of Alexander Granach, who played Nock. He was Jewish. He later went to Hollywood and had a good career. And the thing is, I mean, you know, growing up, I mean, his best friend and possibly the love of his life, Murnau was gay, was a Jewish man, and he was practically adopted by their family.
Right.
Murnau grew up in comfortable circumstances. His father at times was wealthy and then lost wealth, and so even those economic upheavals affected him. But when Murnau wanted to go into the arts and the theater, the father sort of cut him off, and he was almost adopted by this Jewish family. So I don't see the filmmakers aiming to say anything anti-Semitic. But the thing is, it's a film made at a real moment of crisis, right, in terms of demographics, health, and the aftermath of the war.
Well, and that's actually one of the things we can say about why the film, and there's many reasons why the film, I think, is still powerful 100 years later. But one of them is that it is a film that can address each one of the things that you've just mentioned. And for what I'll again call that historically situated audience, they're going to be bringing that to it.
Yes.
They're going to be bringing these things. And Murnau may not have thought at all about this as an allegory that could possibly be interpreted in an anti-Semitic way, but all the surrounding materials are there, and if people want to apply them in a certain way, they're going to do so. And it's also for us 100 years later, since this is a generative film, and there's many embodiments and interpretations of vampires since then. We're seeing it in a different situated way, because we're bringing that whole tradition here, and we're perhaps not thinking in any sense, about the World War I and its devastation, or the fact that almost everyone, if you went to a movie palace in 1922 or 1923. This is just only to underline your point, David. And you did an interview with people coming out, and you asked them, did you lose anyone in your family to the flu in the last year or so? Or you asked them, did you lose anyone in the war? There would probably be no one who said no.
That's right.
Because that is the level of these demographic catastrophes of the war and of the first great pandemic of the modern era of the flu. So the way in which this is a film that is full of anxiety is it's addressing an audience that knows anxiety, and so that brings up this question of why do we go to a film about anxiety when we're full of anxiety? What do you think?
Well, I think of how the Hollywood horror film flourished along with disaster epics during the Great Depression. Is this a cathartic safety valve? Of course, Nosferatu bankrupted its company. There was this company formed, Prana Films, that was going to do things that dealt with the occult and the supernatural, because the producer Alban Grau was interested in those things. And this film was not a financial success. So yes, we do turn to horror in tough times. just for one example of a later period, why did the vampire film in the United States come back during the 80s and 90s during the age of AIDS?
Right.
Film can't help but touch on the nervous system, the pulse of the time. But yes, audiences don't necessarily embrace every film that deals in whatever way with unpleasant issues. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. In the case of Nosferatu, it took a while for it to gain the fully deserved, incredible reputation it has now.
Right. Okay. So let's go back to the source materials, and then what Murnau, more importantly, what Murnau makes of that source materials. So this is actually, whether it's an adaptation or you call it inspired by. This is something that begins with an antecedent work, which is Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula, from 1897. So what do you think Murnau does with it? First of all, for people who've not had the pleasure of reading Bram Stoker's novel, which is very much in print and has been in print for 125 years or more. If you haven't read it, you should read it, because it's an absolutely terrific piece of foundational Gothic horror fiction, written as an epistolary novel, only done in letters. And while there are some letters and things that appear in the film, this is not an epistolary film. So what do you make of where Murnau wants to take Stoker's novel?
Well, the initial interest in vampirism and aspects of the occult probably stems from Albin Grau, who was the producer and also the set designer. He had strong ideas about how the vampire should look. Murnau, jumped on board with this. Henrik Galeen, the screenwriter, had worked on a number of films that are linked with Expressionism. More on that later. But he had worked on, one of the key Golem films. So there are these people who were interested in the fantastic, the occult, the vampire film. They somewhat naively thought that if they changed the names of the characters, Harker and Hutter, Renfield becomes Nach, Mina and Lucy. I mean, the main female character in this is Ellen. Dracula becomes Orlok. They thought they could, do an unauthorized adaptation because this was a fairly low-budget film. I mean, they do change it quite a bit. There are many texts, as you noted, in the film, but it's not done in an epistolary style. Murnau was interested in nature. He was interested in the drama of things. So, I mean, its meaning comes, I think, first and foremost from its visuals. So how do you translate things visually? I mean, I occasionally have students who chuckle a bit. I give them a heads up. They chuckle a bit at the use of fast motion with the carriage and with the loading of the coffins and things like that. But if you consider that, or the use of printing the negative to make the forest white, this is simply Murnau using all the devices of cinema at his command. The dissolves to closer and closer shots of the vampire are really creepy and still effective. The low angle shots, perhaps most famously when he comes from the hold of the ship and he is going to stalk the captain. So how do you adapt a literary work in such strong visual terms? And also, there are other elements we'll get more to when we talk about, I think, issues of gender and sexuality, that the movie just changes and it emphasizes. And this also adds things to the vampire lore. For example, the idea that the vampire can be destroyed by sunlight. Count Dracula in the novel doesn't, hang out at the beach and work on his tan, and he's weakened during the day, but I mean, it doesn't destroy him. Right. So, when you think of the visual terms, the changes in the story, the Van Helsing character in this, Professor Bulwer, is greatly changed as well. So, I mean, they're inspired by the idea of the vampire and the sensuousness of the vampire, and connecting the vampire in many ways with all the animal imagery and the world of nature. Because this is a film that is not only, expressionistic, and we'll talk more about that, it's also a film steeped in the history of German literature, German painting, German romanticism. Because Murnau's background is in art history and literature. He almost completed a doctorate. They even used to call him Herr Doctor, also partly because he'd wear a white coat like a surgeon on the set. But I mean, he's bringing his background, and those are the other people in it, and thus changing the original novel quite a bit. Although Stoker's widow was still not happy and wanted to have the film destroyed.
While we will not go into detail about this is one of those first instances 125 years ago in which, there are rights issues involved. It's an international lawsuit, and there is this question of who's going to be able to make money, and because money is always a question, who's going to be able to make money off of this property, which is the property owned by the widow. So it's not just 21st century Hollywood in which these lawsuits happen and having to do with was this snippet of rap stolen from here and there. These kinds of lawsuits with an emergent mass media, with a new medium like film in which fortunes are being made, all of a sudden the stakes really go up.
That's a very important context. Yes.
Yeah, no, yes. Yeah, absolutely. If you don't, it's always like, well, I actually when I go over with certain graduate students certain issues having to do, and these are filmmaking students, having to do with acquiring intellectual property rights to any number of things, but say a literary work, I said, well, you know, if you choose to go ahead and you don't clear the rights, and let's just say you make a successful film, you will find out who owns the rights. Even if you did a search and you couldn't find it, as soon as that work is successful, rights owners will emerge. But shall we return to the film at hand? So there's you just brought up two subjects that I think we should put in conversation with one another, and that is the traditions in which this film is sometimes located. And one of those traditions is a tradition of Expressionism, and then the other is the older and perhaps broader tradition of German Romanticism. So what are those two arguments, and where do you fall?
Okay. Yeah, there's been quite a scholarly debate. I mean, you will find some notable scholars who say, oh, it's so misleading to label this film as expressionistic. You know, it's not entirely studio-made and quite as stark and artificial as something like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Other people routinely call it expressionistic. No one denies the issue of romanticism. For me, I want to reconcile the two and see a kind of middle ground. I mean, you know, German Expressionism begins early in the 20th century. You know, there are movements in painting, Die Brücke, the bridge, and Die Blaue Reiter, I believe, the Blue Rider. And Expressionism, I mean, spreads throughout the arts, dance. I've seen architecture. I've seen buildings in Germany with, you know, unusual, unexpected curves, or sometimes, you know, stark angles to them. And of course, it found its way into theater and through that into the cinema. You know, it's one of the many isms that, you know, breaks with realism. You know, often stark a look to things. I mean, you can think of shots of, you know, or not shots, paintings or drawings by expressionistic artists of, you know, twisted soldiers from World War I, prostitutes on the streets of Berlin, you know, bold swaths of color, sharp geometrical compositions that, you know, push it so far as to move toward abstraction. There's this interest in the upheavals of society. There's often dark elements, supernatural elements, you know, a concern with insanity. And many expressionistic works not only express the presence of the artist in a, you know, anything but invisible way. It's also, expressionism is also seen as a way, you know, through the mise en scène and the look of rendering subjective states in an external way. And the thing is, I mean, in the film, you know, Nock sitting on his stool with that window, you know, could be something right out of Caligari. I think the film's use of arches within arches is very expressionistic. You know, the overall tone of the film and the mood of the film connects with expressionism. But of course, you know, perhaps most famously, there are those who say, oh, you know, vampires aren't supposed to cast any shadow. Well, forget that, because one of my favorite images in the history of the cinema is, you know, Count Orlok's shadow creeping up the steps, his fingers getting elongated, and you have just, you know, the way the stairs are represented when he's creeping up on Ellen. So it's a film full of expressionistic touches, even if it's not, because there's so much location shooting in various German cities and in Slovakia. So there's a lot more location shooting than the studio-bound expressionistic films, but I think it has that strong expressionistic side to it. As far as romanticism, you know, from that, there we get, you know, the use of nature, the clash between nature and culture, you know, the idealized figure of a woman. You get, you know, the figure of the double, the doppelganger. It was just, you know, I think really good luck that you contacted me when you did, because a couple weeks before, my husband and I saw a wonderful exhibit at the Met of the paintings of a key painter in German Romanticism, Caspar David Friedrich.
Absolutely.
So I mean, if you and there's shot after shot that are clearly modeled after it. People have even said that, you know, when the doctor is examining a victim, that was inspired by Rembrandt's anatomy lesson painting. So, you know, I mean, Murnau knew his art history. He knew his literature. The film is very much in that kind of Gothic romantic tradition. but with many strong expressionistic touches. So in other words, I want to have my cake and eat it too.
Well, you did a pretty good job of convincing me.
Okay.
Okay. No. And I think that this also speaks to the antecedent question I had of what's he up to? Well, he is finding through this kind of hybridity that you're talking about, he is finding the tropes and visual expressive means that cinema is capable of turning a novel written into letters into something that is a uniquely cinematic rendering of a vampire story. You know, we don't have so many more minutes to go, so I wanted us to touch on the issue, because it's one of the things that you work on in your scholarship, on this, of gender representation in the film. Now, in something like Caligari, you know, one of the oppositions is always straightforwardly madness versus sanity, and it is not as Caligari is gendered, but it doesn't foreground gender in certain kinds of ways that I think we become aware of in this film. And so, where do you take that? Where does that fit into the way you see and interpret the film?
Well, Murnau films are often famous for their somewhat weak, passive, feminized men. And if you think of a movie like Sunrise or Faust, you often have, like what I said earlier, these kind of, you know, asexual Madonna figures. But you know, a number of Murnau films have what happens when this innocent couple encounters elements of chaos, or you know, something moves onto the dark side, or who is this interrupting figure? I mean, to make a connection with perhaps Murnau's most famous film, Sunrise, the husband and wife seem to be happy, and then the woman from the city, dressed in black, she is a vamp, which is, you know, short for vampire.
Right,
so that connects things. And so, you know, the character of Hutter, he's got his frilly clothing. I mean, he's an often helpless hero. When Orlok approaches, I mean, like a child, he just hides under the covers. His body is often draped in a feminine way. He's much more a sexualized object, you know, shirtless and his high boots and things like that, than the wife is. And the thing is, you know, the legend that the film puts forth is that a woman who's pure at heart can destroy the vampire. So, I mean, does that mean chaste? So, I mean, that raises the issue of, wait, if they're a married couple, is she still a virgin?
Right, yeah.
And yet, I mean, she's got to be seductive enough to keep the vampire by her side.
Right.
Some people have read Orlok as being sort of sexuality itself. I mean, he doesn't care who he puts the bite on.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, and you know, throughout the film, I mean, even the editing, as Murnau crosscuts, there are times when Nina, you know, sleepwalking rather like César in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, you know, she will say things like, you know, he is coming, you know, I must be ready. I mean, you know, is she addressing her husband? There are times it will then cut to a shot of Orlok, or is she addressing Orlok? So there is this triangulation going on with, you know, I mean, is Orlok a double for Hutter? But he also has these things that, you know, very much connect him with Nina. And it's this incredibly sensuous film. I'll just quickly give one example. One of the most famous shots, when the shadow of his hand is creeping up Nina's body and grabs at her. I mean, is he grabbing her heart, or is he clutching her breast?
Right.
And is her reaction, you know, one of pain, or is it one of almost sexual ecstasy? So, you know, I mean, it's an incredibly sensuous film.
Right, absolutely.
And it's an incredibly ambiguous film in this sort of triangulation of desire and the gender roles that are being performed.
Well, you know, this connects it in certain ways with many of the questions raised by the Weimar cinema, but also concretely with Expressionism, is where are these boundaries between object and subject, between sanity and you know, and madness, and between gender categories and a much more fluid or plural sense of what constitutes eros, what constitutes libidinous activity, you know, etc. So that's one of I think of the ways in which the film continues to live with us. And so we don't have that much time left. So let's talk a little bit about It's 100 years old. What is the legacy of Nosferatu? Because it's not only a distinguished work of art by all standards, but it's also a very influential one.
Yes. I'll just, catalog a few things. I mean, of course, it influenced, the horror film immensely. People like James Whale, studied the great German silent films. Other filmmakers did too. But I mean, you see its influence all over the place. You can see images like, the White Forest. The surrealists love this film. Jean Cocteau loved this film. So you see its influence in Jean Cocteau. In Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, there are images directly out of this film. In Tim Burton's, I believe it's Batman Returns, there's a character named Max Schreck, who is the lead character, and Schreck means, terror or in German. There's a character named Max Schreck in the film. More directly, I mean, there's Werner Herzog's beautifully done a remake in 1979. Last year, Robert Eggers, a really interesting filmmaker, if you know The Witch and the Lighthouse, he did his own version of it. There's been a novel called Nosferatu in Love. There's been an opera. I have students who have seen, Orlok figures in their video games. So, I mean, the influence is just immense in our culture.
We're going to have to end with immense influence. Okay. So, if you like our discussion here and you'd like to know more about City Cinematheque, the Weimar series, or the other things we do here, please visit our website. Visit the CUNY TV website. That's www.tv.cuny.edu. There you're going to find our schedule. You're also going to find a way to communicate with us by email if you wish to. And you can also find the new CUNY TV app. So you can download the app and you can take CUNY TV with you using that app. So please visit www.tv.cuny.edu. What a pleasure to have you back, bringing a wealth of knowledge about this film and about how it fits in historical context, artistic context. Always a pleasure to chat with you, David.
Thank you, Jerry. I had a great time. You always do a great job, and it's really fun to be back. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. And please join us in the future here at CUNY TV on City Cinematheque as we continue our stroll through the archives of film history. For now, it's goodbye.